Welcome to Warkworth, a truly gorgeous village nestled a stone's throw from the coast of Northumberland in north-east England. And this village is famed not just for the magnificent castle standing before us here, but also a spectacular sloping high street lined with historic village pubs, shops and houses, a magnificently preserved parish church dating back to the early 12th century, and an elegant medieval bridge across the tranquil River Coquet, on one side of which there stands an imposing fortified gate, which has been defending the village of Warkworth for some 700 years. All of that and plenty more is to come over the next 15 minutes or so, as we take a brief stroll through Warkworth as the sun sets on a gorgeous summer's evening. But we of course begin with the village's most famous landmark of all, the remains of the mighty Warkworth Castle. This grand medieval fortress boasts just under 900 years of history, but its origins are surprisingly murky. It's possible that Warkworth Castle was originally conceived back in the late 1130s by the son of the Scottish King David I. But it may actually have been first built by the English King Henry II, soon after in the 1150s. But these mid-12th century developments were simply a prologue to Warkworth Castle's lengthy story, because the present castle, with its imposing stone gateway here, was built a few decades later, over the course of 15 years between 1199 and 1214. Much of Warkworth Castle as we see it today, then, is around 800 years old, and in the centuries before it fell into ruin, it was caught up in a series of vicious conflicts. Initially, those fought between the armies of England and Scotland. Originally built to establish English authority over this hotly contested region, Warkworth Castle was an inevitable target of Scottish aggression. In 1327 and 1341, the Scots laid siege to this fortress, and, although they failed to capture it, plundered the village of Warkworth outside. The castle survived thanks to its immense defences. Just in front of us here are the remains of the once great Carrickfergus Tower, an early 13th century tower which occupied a commanding position over the castle moat and any would-be attackers, and which only collapsed into its current ruinous state in the 18th century, some 500 years after it was originally built. Having dropped down into the castle ditch, looking up we can see just how formidable a fortress this would have appeared, standing high atop a man-made mound, in a famous layout known as a motte and bailey. Standing high above the village of Warkworth, the surrounding countryside, and the sea just over a mile away, those defending Warkworth Castle here had unrivalled views over the landscape, further strengthening their position in the face of attack. Beside us on the right is the bailey, the main area of the castle, but around the corner we see the motte, on top of which there stands the castle keep, the most strongly defended part of the fortress, in which its residents would live and take shelter during a siege. But despite its sturdy construction and intelligent layout, Warkworth wasn't entirely impenetrable. This castle was in fact captured on a number of occasions through history. The forces of King Henry IV forced the resident Percy family, once the most powerful in Northumberland, out of Warkworth Castle in a siege of 1405. And a few decades later, during the Wars of the Roses, Warkworth Castle was captured by the Yorkist forces, and it became their headquarters in what was at the time a region which sided mostly with the rival Lancastrians. However, the ruins that we see today aren't the result of a battle from centuries ago, but rather the fact that, in the 18th century, this castle was simply left to crumble. Once a vital part of the defence of Northumberland, Warkworth Castle's military credentials had become outdated, and so it was mostly abandoned, with locals even stripping parts of its stonework to build themselves cottages nearby, on the streets of the village which stands in the shadow of the mighty castle. Here the village's main street climbs the hill towards Warkworth Castle, which, by standing at the very top of the village, is undoubtedly one of the most eye-catching medieval fortresses in Northumberland. And that's no small feat for a region which is packed to the brim with stunning castles. Taking a look at a map, we can see exactly where the castle and village of Warkworth are located, roughly halfway up the coast of Northumberland, about 30 miles north of the city of Newcastle upon Tyne, and 30 miles south of the border with Scotland. Closer to Warkworth, you'll find Northumberland's county town of Alnwick, home of the prestigious Alnwick Castle, which is now most famous for its starring role as Hogwarts in the first 2 Harry Potter movies. Further north are the likes of Dunstanburgh Castle, Bamborough Castle, and the spectacular Lindisfarne Castle on the Holy Island just off the coast. All of these fortresses boasting a history just as riveting as Warkworth's here. But of course, there is more to this Northumberland village than just its famous castle. And so let's now make our way down Castle Street, Warkworth's main road, and discover the many more treasures that this village has to offer. As you can see, Castle Street slopes steeply down from its namesake at the top of the village, and it's lined on both sides by long terraces of houses, which are home to just a few of Warkworth's roughly 1,500 residents. Late in the evening, the streets of this small Northumberland village are tranquil and quiet, but during the day, Warkworth remains a hugely popular tourist destination, with its castle standing as the main draw for visitors, alongside its wealth of historic architecture and old-world charm. Warkworth is home to gorgeous buildings from a variety of different eras. Many of the houses lining Castle Street here date from the 18th and 19th centuries, although some, such as the Old Smithy here, where the village blacksmith once lived and worked, may be even older. It's said that this fetching stone building may even date from the late 17th century. All of that is to say that life on the outskirts of the castle has been ever present through Warkworth's history, where residents have endured through the many different conflicts and armies which came knocking at the village's door. Most of life here has crowded along the path of Castle Street. This main road is where you'll find essential village facilities like the old well here, where locals would come to collect drinking water. But this wasn't just a part of town visited by local people. In fact, people from all over Northumberland, and even further, would make their way down Warkworth's main road, whether just passing through as they travelled on this, the main route along the Northumberland coast, or staying over at one of the village's many historic inns. In front of us here is the rather large Hermitage Inn, an 18th century tavern which was built to greet travellers in the days of horse and carriages. The large opening on the right side of the building was where carriages would pull in to park at the inn's yard just inside. And standing directly across the street is the Mason's Arms, an older pub of the 17th century which holds an impressive claim to fame. In October of 1715, it was at this pub where a group of Jacobite rebels dined, discussing who was the rightful king of Great Britain. And the morning after their dinner here, for the first time, they publicly proclaimed their support for James Stuart, the son of the deposed King James II. Warkworth became the first place in England to declare for the Jacobite cause, at the start of a rebellion which engulfed Britain for an entire year, and ended with defeat for the men who had dined here. Their famous meal took place in the pub just beside the village's historic Market Cross here, this monument denoting the place where markets have been held in this village since as long ago as the 12th century. Now, the Market Cross itself isn't quite that old. It dates from around 1830, but it's a rebuild of a much older cross which stood at the centre of an important part of Warkworth. Unlike the steep slope up at the top of Castle Street, this area of the village is largely flat, and so it was here that markets could be held, where agricultural produce from the surrounding countryside, and fish caught in the sea just a short distance from here, were bought and sold for centuries. In fact, though it may not look like it now, Warkworth was just as much of a coastal harbour village as a countryside market town. And in between periods of destruction, when warring armies came rushing through, Warkworth actually flourished for much of the medieval era, as an important centre of trade. This open space, known as Dial Place, was ideal for the hosting of markets, though now, as we can see, it's mostly used as a car park for locals and some visitors who come to Warkworth on day trips. If you are visiting Warkworth by car, it's probably a better idea to park up by the castle, where there are far more spaces than here in the village centre. But once again, there is much more to Warkworth than its castle. In fact, this village's story began as many as 300 years before that famous fortress was built, with the church building that we find just here. This is St Lawrence's Church, Warkworth's gorgeous medieval parish church, which was originally built back in the early 12th century, just under 900 years ago. Remarkably, not much has changed about the church since then. The tower that we see on the left was added in the year 1200, and a couple of centuries later, the building was expanded in size. But that's about it. St Lawrence's Church as we see it today looks almost exactly the same as it did around 600 years ago. Of course, it served principally as the place where the people of Warkworth could worship, but the church also doubled as a defensive mechanism for the villagers. Looking at the church, you might notice that its windows are a little smaller than the grand stained glass ones you'll find in most churches around the country. This, along with its sturdy stone walls, was a deliberate design to keep people safe inside from enemy forces. In fact, as the rain starts to come down over Warkworth, during the many Scottish raids of the medieval era, where the village was plundered and burned, the few hundred people who lived here took refuge inside this church. But although this church is now Grade 1 listed on account of its beautifully preserved, almost unaltered Norman architecture, it wasn't the first church to stand here in Warkworth. In fact, not by a long way. As we wipe away a raindrop on the camera lens, Warkworth's very first church was a small, wooden, Anglo-Saxon building that we first hear of in the year 737 AD, and it belonged to Lindisfarne Priory, the famous monastery on the Holy Island some 25 miles north of here. The monks at Lindisfarne, the cradle of Christianity in northern England, were granted this church by the Christian king of Northumbria, as part of efforts to further spread the religion across Great Britain. But Warkworth's original church was fairly short-lived. It was likely destroyed in the year 875 AD by Viking raiders, who began plundering the Northumberland coast at the beginning of their era of dominance in England. Indeed, Warkworth was especially vulnerable to these attacks, as it sits close to the coast and the mouth of the River Coquet, which flows around the back of St Lawrence's Church, and where we'll head towards now. The river is another of Warkworth's many charming attractions, but while the church stands on its south bank here, on the river's north bank, about half a mile from the village centre, is another of Warkworth's most famous landmarks, an isolated hermitage that's accessible only by boat. Lending its name to the Hermitage Inn, which we passed earlier, the Warkworth Hermitage is a stunning chapel which is carved into a cliff overlooking the river. It was likely established in the early 15th century as a private chapel for Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, who lived in Warkworth Castle. But the hermitage was largely unknown until the late 18th century, when it became the subject of a famous poem of 1771, The Hermit of Warkworth. This evocative poem is often credited with sparking a wider fascination with this village, as early tourists began arriving, not just to see the hermitage, but also the castle, and this, the beautiful medieval Warkworth Bridge. Built in the late 14th century across the River Coquet, Warkworth's gorgeous stone bridge was the only way in and out of the village from the north for as many as 600 years, carrying everybody from invading armies to horse and coaches, and even motor cars through the centuries. Since 1965, road traffic has passed over the modern bridge that we can see just to the right. But this historic river crossing remains open to pedestrians, and a simple stroll across its cobblestones offers some unmissable rewards, particularly if you take a moment to stop and gaze out over the scenery of the River Coquet. As the sunset lights up the rain clouds on this tranquil Northumberland evening, we can marvel at the beauty of this majestic river, which flows for more than 50 miles from the Scottish border out into the North Sea, which is just under a mile from here. Perhaps most importantly though, the River Coquet encircles Warkworth on 3 sides, providing a handy natural defence for the village, a kind of secondary moat for the castle. Situated high up at the top of the village, and with a river surrounding it on 3 sides, the castle was difficult to capture. But it wasn't the only thing that needed protecting, because between it and any attackers crossing the river here was the village of Warkworth itself. So at one end of this bridge, where invading armies from the north would approach the village, a large fortified gateway was built, creating a narrow bottleneck that made entry to Warkworth a real challenge for unwelcome guests. Today, this gateway forms part of what is the only surviving fortified bridge in all of England, a remarkable landmark which stands as one of many to be found in the gorgeous village of Warkworth. But having made our way down from the top of the village by the castle, past the historic inns of the main road, through the churchyard, and out to the banks of the River Coquet, we've sadly come to the end of our walk around Warkworth. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making your own trip to Warkworth sometime soon.